Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herrenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are going to finish up Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. But before we do that, as always, some housekeeping. If you are enjoying this podcast and you are listening to it on Spotify or a podcast platform, please consider leaving us a review. That always helps people discover us, and we really appreciate hearing what people think of an episode. Also, if you are watching this on YouTube, as I know many of you are, please consider like, subscribe, comment for all the same reasons. We really appreciate it, and it helps get the word out. Since we are finishing up Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries today, I want to talk about what our plan is for the next couple podcasts at least. Next month, I will be out of town for enough time that we are going to not do our regular episode, but we don't want to leave you without anything. So what we're going to do is actually do a short episode about a kid's book that we actually use a lot in our work. It's a fantastic book all about Dave the Potter, or David Drake. And he was an enslaved man who was also a very talented potter who left poetry on some of his pots. And it's a fantastic story. And so we're going to talk about that next time.
And I think it's important to note that even people who do not have children might enjoy the story of David Drake. So it's worth listening to for that as well. And there are articles and adult books out there about him as well.
Right. And we're going to take a little deeper dive than the book goes into, but the book frankly does a pretty darn good job. So it is definitely still worth listening to, even if you are not interested in the kids' book itself. After that, we will get back into our regularly scheduled programming, I suppose you could say. And we decided that since we held that poll, The Lost City of the Monkey God had enough response, even though it didn't win the poll, that we are actually going to go ahead and read that one. So that book is titled The Lost City of the Monkey God, A True Story by Douglas Preston. And I'm not going to read that whole synopsis, but I'll leave a link for the book in the notes so you can check it out yourself. But it essentially is about investigations in Central America into some temples that people have looked for in the 1940s and not been able to find. And then current technology, primary LiDAR, I believe, has allowed us to relocate these temples and learn about the cultures that built them. So look forward to that. It comes highly recommended by someone I know as well. So we're ready to dive into that one. And fortunately, this one has a bunch of options. This is definitely a cheaper book than the one we are currently reading. So that's also a plus for it.
I'm excited about it because, one of the things you and I always talk about is how archaeologists do indeed use technology. So this will be a cool example of that,
right.
I think.
I also want to take a moment to acknowledge on YouTube, Tom Rubino left us a message. Apparently, they took classes with the author of our current book back when they were in college and wanted us to know that the author's last name, Feder, is actually pronounced Fader instead of Feder like we've been saying it. So thank you for letting us know that. I never would have picked that up from the text itself, and we do want to try and get those things right whenever we can. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. Now, Barbara is on an older book version, remember, than I am on the most current one. So our chapter numbers are out of sync, but mine is titled The Mystery of Ancient Civilizations.
Mine is just Mysterious Egypt.
Okay, that's interesting because mine talks a lot about Egypt, but it's more than just Egypt.
Okay, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
This is a follow-up to the previous chapter where the author detailed the ancient aliens stuff and why it is a lot of nonsense. Ancient Aliens and Atlantis, and the one before that even, I think. So this one gets a little bit into how people actually did what they did, which, as we've talked about, is exciting to me because I find that a lot more fascinating than made-up stories about aliens doing it for them. Because the ingenuity and creativity in this and the development in the process is fascinating and really cool.
Yeah, oftentimes the real story is much more interesting than the made-up alien story.
So this starts with a little bit more talking about diffusionist views, which, if you recall, means there was an idea that all innovation started in one place and then it moved to other places. And the kind of the extreme take on that is that all innovation had to start with one culture, particularly one culture that is no longer in existence, i.e. Atlantis, even if they don't necessarily say Atlantis. diffusionism is not considered reality anymore. We have, I think, very solid evidence that completely isolated cultures developed the same technology, sometimes at relatively same time, sometimes much different times, but they could do it independently of each other. And then we go into Göbekli Tepe, which is kind of cool because we talked about this all the way back in Four Lost Cities a little bit. This was in the Catalhayuk episode, which is currently our most listened to episode. In that book, this was kind of an afterthought, but it was talking about monumental architecture, and this predated Catalhayuk by, I think, a couple thousand years. And it's important in this case because it's an example of early monumental construction. It also bucks some of the trends that we thought were the case, where, for example, we thought people needed agriculture and stability in one place to really develop these huge monumental complexes, where in this case, these folks were hunter-gatherers. So they were not strictly in one place. There's a lot of fascinating research around this complex and a lot of questions, and we definitely don't have all of the answers yet, but look forward to that as it develops, because this is a really cool and unusual, at least in our experience so far, monumental site.
That is interesting, because does yours talk a lot about Egypt at the beginning and how a lot of people think Egypt was that culture by which things disseminated from?
No, we do dive into Egypt next, but not necessarily. Well, I think it's mentioned. It's not talked about that a lot.
Mine, it doesn't do a super deep dive, but it does talk about how people think that Egypt is the culture by which, all these different things like animal domestication, ceramics, writing, even metallurgy and stuff all kind of stem from Egypt and diffused out.
Mm-hmm.
But when you were talking, I was like, I need to check my notes because I don't even remember this. But mine, yeah, your chapter is completely different and updated, it seems, which is really, I think that's a good sign.
Yeah. Well, and the focus for the Egypt part is talking about there's this idea that archaeologists claim Egypt just appeared out of nowhere.
Yeah, he does talk about that too. Yeah.
And in reality, he spends a lot of time breaking it down, like how, no, actually, we can see a very clear
pattern. Yeah.
And it's pretty cool. I don't know that we will get into all of it, but it's worth reading if that's something that interests you. Starting with small towns, some of those towns developing into major economic centers and gaining power, and then finally into royal cemetery complexes using
which
mud brick.
I thought that was really interesting. I had not really learned a lot about that, so I thought that was kind of cool. It's just the evolution of the pyramid and how burials were done, I guess is the correct word. And he also, in my book, he takes this opportunity to reiterate how wrong Von Daniken is, which, if you recall, Von Daniken is the guy who had that ridiculous theme park.
Yeah.
And one of his worlds was Egypt, and he wanted to claim how Egypt was created by aliens and just kind of appeared out of nowhere. So he takes this opportunity to reiterate and back up with specifics why that is not the case.
Yeah. So kind of the path here is we start with quite a few mud brick tombs, essentially, and these get slowly larger and larger, I guess. He takes constant pains to point out that, like, there's depictions of people on the tombs, and they're humans.
Right.
They're Egyptian people. They are not Atlanteans or aliens.
Yeah.
Right. One of the first ones to really design these, actually, we know their name, Imhotep.
Yeah, that was cool to me.
And he's a well-documented and very clever man. And again, we see depictions of him. He's not an alien. He's not from Atlantis. He is an Egyptian person.
And by modern standards, he's so impressive to me because not only was he an architect, right, which in and of itself is just someone who's very accomplished in my mind, but he was also a well-known physician. Mm-hmm. He was a priest, a poet, an advisor, and statues show him as just an ordinary guy. He wasn't anybody who was different looking anyway, or including not an alien.
Yeah.
He was just an ordinary guy who was very accomplished and written about a lot.
Yep. Then we advance to some early stone stepped pyramids. Remember, stepped pyramids are a thing that we see in other places in the world too. That does not mean they came from Egypt or Atlantis. These are smaller in these earlier stages, but they are, monumental architecture essentially. And there's different shapes as they kind of figure out how they want to build these or how they can be built. But there's a very clear development in size, complexity. One of my favorites was, you've probably seen this one, the pyramid that starts at one angle and then it changes to another angle part way up. That was because they started to build it. 4 of the corners were on bedrock and one of them was on gravel, and under the weight, the gravel corner corner started to collapse. So the angle change was actually a last-minute attempt to try and prevent that corner from collapsing entirely.
Which, how human
Right.
is that? You
Like,
know,
oh, we
like,
can't undo this now. We just got to
yeah,
try and fix it on the
yeah.
spot. And so that was kind of the last precursor to what we think of as modern pyramids, where they finally had this all figured out and figured out the process and everything.
And they've located the quarries for some of the pyramids, and through experimental archaeology, essentially, they've been able to come up with theories about how they built the pyramids.
Interesting. Does he get on that here?
Yeah, it does.
Mine waits a little bit.
Oh, well, it's really interesting to be doing two different versions.
Well, yeah. So if we can, before we do that, actually, we cut over to a couple other cases of monumental architecture. So let's talk about that first and then move back to the pyramids. He then goes into the Maya, explaining the Maya. He doesn't spend a lot of time on the Maya, which I thought was interesting because we know a lot about the Maya civilization. But, when they were built, we can see that transition from small hamlets to more complex economic centers. We can see that development of architecture and everything as well. And then similarly with Stonehenge. Stonehenge is interesting because it has had different forms at different times. It started off as just a ditch, basically, and then it was a wooden structure at some point.
I know I'm having to flip through my notes because he does talk about Stonehenge, but it's later on and possibly in even a different chapter.
Well, we might come... Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and finish here then, if that's
go
all right.
ahead.
Yeah. As far as hauling the stones, they know exactly where they came from. They found the tools that they were used. There were no draft animals, so they were hauling them with human power. But all this was still very possible for humans to accomplish. And that's kind of the key takeaway here.
And I know, like, we think of Stonehenge, a lot of us that aren't super familiar with the history in Europe or, haven't been there. There are other similar structures throughout Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a few of them, I believe, too. So that's something else to keep in mind. That's the most famous one and maybe even one of the larger ones, but there are others.
Yeah. So yeah, we know how they were moved, how they were quarried. Interestingly, they were quarried using fire and cold water to crack the rocks and then working with the natural cracks, and then erected using levers. And interestingly, the most challenging, of course, would be the horizontal blocks on top. And so they have lintels and levers, and they have a whole bunch of, they basically have it all worked out different ways this could have been done. But again, the important takeaway is something people can do.
Right.
And also we have plenty of cultural context around it, so it didn't just appear out of nowhere. He does talk a little bit about the debate around whether or not it is actually astronomical calendar. Apparently this is in debate. My understanding of the debate is leaning towards the stone portion is not an astronomical calendar. It is associated with solstices, but not with telling the seasons and that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, in my book, this is in another chapter, but he goes into a little bit about that. And at the time of the writing of my book, it coincides with the solstices and stuff, but we don't know much more.
Right. Now, I think there is good evidence that the wooden structure that was inside of it as a precursor to the stone structure, I think they have good evidence that actually was associated with some sort of calendar, but the stones themselves do not seem to be. Though there is some debate around that, so it is definitely not a settled thing. And then one more little piece before we return back to the Egyptian pyramids. He has a section called A Lost Civilization, but it's not Atlantis. Well, maybe it's Atlantis. And so this is essentially talking about how the people who are pushing the Atlantis ideas have gotten more and more kind of sneaky about how they suggest it without saying it, because they know it'll be rejected. But if they can get the idea in people's heads, I think is kind of the idea.
Oh, interesting.
And actually, conveniently, I have a very recent example of this. Someone we know them well enough to know that they didn't read the post carefully, because they wouldn't have posted this if they understood what it was.
Oh, yes. Okay.
But it's interesting because it's multiple paragraphs for a Facebook post, which is already very interesting. But it's about how archaeologists have been investigating the Easter Island heads and found that some of them actually have bodies that are buried in the ground, which is very cool. And this is very real. This is a thing. It is not a terribly recent thing. It's maybe 4 or 5 years old at this point, but it is something that is real. So that's good, and is talking about them, very factual for the first couple paragraphs. if you have the context of this book, you can start to see some cracks. By the second paragraphs, where did they get the manpower to bury dozens and dozens of stone giants in the middle of the ocean? Unanswered questions. Second paragraph is more about how, Egyptians accomplished some of these things, but they had like a huge population to do it. And it just, again, if you're not prepared, this reads like this is a remarkable thing that a relatively small population was able to accomplish, not necessarily doubting that they accomplished it. Second to last paragraph is where it finally starts to really show. The end of that paragraph is, was a civilization unknown to us that later disappeared due to natural cataclysm, or what? And then the final paragraph is just, again, it never says Atlantis, but basically there's scientific journals have shown that there was a series of comets that entered the atmosphere, shattering 1,000 pieces. Earth was hit by a veritable bombardment of fragments that struck at least 4 continents. Nothing was ever the same again. There was a real, quotation marks, apocalypse in prehistory which wiped out an unknown number of, quotation mark, for some reason, Homo sapiens.
Wait, Homo sapiens is in quotations?
Right.
Oh, weird.
Which, again, remember what context of what we're studying here, right? Do the ruins of Easter Island correspond to those of, oh, that's right, Göbekli Tepe is in here again, because they talk about how the site is so strange and deep mysteries and was an ancient civilization that they can construct that, and it's just like, if you have the context of like this book that we're talking about here and you read this, is like very clear what's going on.
Yeah.
But I can very much see how if you don't have that context, it's not immediately obvious how bananas this is.
Yeah, I will say you have more patience than me, because I saw that post and I immediately was just like, oh goodness. And I didn't even bother reading it, which I probably should have just in preparation for our podcast.
Honestly, most of the times I wouldn't. I did it because, this is actually very relevant to what we're talking about right now. I'm going to make sure I study this a bit. So yeah, this section is just him talking about people who do this kind of thing. It details some of the arguments they make. They're very familiar. It's very diffusionist stuff we've heard before.
Yeah.
It does end with a very direct claim that, so much of the monumental architecture around the world is apparently supposed to be a coded message from this ancient civilization warning us about the catastrophe that wiped them out and could wipe us out. And his question is like, well, if they had all the time to build all of these monumental architectures around the world, why wouldn't they spend that time to preventing the catastrophe or finding a way to survive that catastrophe? It's really bizarre. And then, of course, it ends with the Atlanteans were white people.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And even worse, it takes the colonialist myths of white gods in Africa at face value without questioning where they come from. It's, again, if you've been following the rest of this book, it all just kind of fits in with trends here, unfortunately.
It's interesting you mentioned like how if they had all this time to build all these great monuments and things, why didn't they prepare for their ending, their end? I feel like it's funny for us to think that was the case when some might argue we're kind of doing the same thing now in some ways.
We're not trying to leave messages for future generations, though.
Okay, that's fair.
That would be the key distinction, I think. Putting your heads in the sand is a very human thing to do.
That's true, yes.
But
yeah.
Thinking far enough ahead to warn people that don't do what we did, that's a little weird. Actually, interestingly, too, is either this civilization was completely wiped out, leaving absolutely zero evidence that it ever existed, which we know is preposterous, very well established in this book, or it's under Antarctica where we can't see it because of the ice. So both convenient, like you can't prove that we're wrong here, so therefore we must be right kind of an argument.
Which is definitely something that's addressed in this book.
Yep.
Yeah, mine talks about the pyramids, and it goes into it talks a little bit about how some of the stones that were used in the construction of the pyramids had little handling bosses and other evidence on them.
And those handles were removed once they were in place, typically.
Yeah. And some had like sockets in them for levers and stuff like that. So more evidence. There was also paintings and, of them using oil to lubricate the path, and talks about some experimental archaeology that's been been done to show that that's definitely plausible.
They moved them on wood sleds, and we
Mhm.
found the sleds.
Yeah, he does also mention some people say, oh, well, where's the evidence of all the ancillary structures that would have been constructed to help build the pyramids? And he's like, well, they would have been removed just like you remove scaffolding after a modern building is built.
I think maybe a bit of an update here is apparently there is some good evidence, or at least hypotheses, that the outside scaffolding would have become kind of ridiculously difficult at some point.
Yeah, he talks about that in my book too.
So they actually
Had the interior.
used interior scaffold, or interior routes anyway.
Yeah,
Which
he
is
talks
interesting.
about.
A little hard for me to picture, honestly.
Well, I actually went, he was talking about, I think it was Khufu's pyramid, and there was some 3D modeling done that shows the interior patterns, and, because they started seeing these passageways that were kind of off in different directions and didn't really make sense. They didn't lead to a burial. There was a thought that they might be like air holes for the workers inside and things like that. And they started piecing all of it together in a 3D model and realized that it was quite possible that it was the remnants of that kind of interior structure.
So they did a microgravimetric survey in the 80s.
Yeah.
That showed a lower density spiral inside. And at the time, they didn't have an explanation for that. But now that would fit very nicely with this hypothesis of an interior.
Yeah. And if you go online and you just Google Khufu's pyramid, there's a lot of 3D models on like YouTube. There's videos. There's been some documentaries about it that can kind of give you a good visual.
I think there's Minecraft recreations.
Oh, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
I think there actually are, if I remember right.
But it's pretty cool and pretty ingenious.
Yeah. Again, that's kind of the thrust here, right? That while tales of lost cities and aliens visiting ancient civilizations are fascinating and cool, the actual ingenuity and sheer effort that goes into actually doing this is actually really neat.
Yeah.
And we're doing people in the past a disservice, and ourselves, frankly, by claiming that we are not capable of this without modern technology.
Right. And after he talks about that in my book, which also another thing I wanted to mention along those lines is they have actually found the tools that were used to construct the pyramids. They have found chisels and mallets and other, measuring tools, things like that would have been used.
Mammoths or death rays or whatever,
right.
laser cutting tools or whatever you think that they used. Yeah.
Right. So there's ample evidence that shows that these were indeed built by humans. And at this point, to say it was aliens is just...
Yeah, it's not existing in isolation. There is a whole very clear path to this. Not that we always know the exact way sometimes, but we know some ways it could have been done.
Right. But after all of that, he starts talking about King Tutankhamun. Does he talk about him at all in your...
I don't think so. Go ahead.
Really? So King Tut was my early obsession with archaeology as a kid. And so anytime I can read about King Tut, I still get excited because when I was a kid, I considered myself an expert by way of every book in my school library. But there's the whole idea of the curse and the proof that... or the fact that there was no curse, but there's this whole, again, reality is more interesting than the myth. So he talks a lot about the history of King Tut. So he died young. He wasn't supposed to amount to much. He wasn't a very popular ruler. It's the fact that Howard Carter found his tomb and all the gold that was in it is what makes him popular. And the reason all this gold and stuff was in there was because his tomb wasn't looted, because his tomb wasn't supposed to be his tomb, right? They didn't build a pyramid for him because he died. They didn't have a chance to do so. He died unexpectedly. And so he was built in a tomb that was meant for someone lesser than him. So nobody really looted it because he was a kind of a forgotten king. And looking at the tomb from the outside, you're like, there's not going to be much in there. So early on, they're like, oh, he must have been so important because of all this stuff that's left in his tomb. And it's like, no, he was forgotten.
Right.
That's why this stuff is left in his tomb. And I thought that was interesting. So Howard Carter was the one who investigated his tomb. And there's this story of the curse around it, how everybody died. Howard Carter lived for years after this excavation. And there's apparently some story where someone's like, but he was cursed because for the rest of his life, he was stuck investigating all the objects from this tomb. And he's like, that's not a curse to an archaeologist.
Or that's a career.
Right. Yeah.
Which,
So
you might claim as a curse still, but that's a matter of
right.
perspective then.
But it was kind of funny. The wealthy benefactor who funded the excavation he died 4 months after the tomb was opened, but he was already known to be like weak and ill at the time of the excavation. And there's stories of lights going out the second they opened the tomb, but the Egyptian power grid at that time was very sporadic anyways, and that was something that occurred pretty regularly in Egypt at the time. So he was just talking about how, all these things that kind of lead up to the myth are actually kind of ordinary things.
Yeah.
I found that
None of
fascinating.
that in here.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
Interesting, yeah.
But King Tut's so cool.
He is a forgotten king.
Nah.
Okay, so one little bit in the FAQ that I thought worth mentioning is that there is no evidence that the pyramids were built by slaves. It's kind of important for us to understand that. He goes in a little bit more detail. Basically, the Hebrew accounts are from a different era. The evidence is that people who physically built the pyramids were citizens and people who were hired or on some whatever their system accounted for, not enslaved people. That's all I had for that chapter.
Well, and that makes sense. I mean, think about how many enslaved people it would take and the logistics behind all of that. Having a ready, able-bodied, willing population to help seems more realistic.
Yeah.
At least at that scale.
All right, so the next chapter for me is titled Good Vibrations, and it's all about psychics and archaeology.
Yeah, mine's Good Vibrations, Psychics and Dowsers. So
Ooh.
same thing.
Yeah, we talk about the same stuff in mine. It essentially starts off with kind of establishing that this isn't magic. There's nothing magical about it. It can seem a little magical when an archaeologist, and he actually has a personal account where like he looked at a map and told his crew there's going to be a site there, and they were like amazed. And he's like, no, this is just logic. See, here's the water, here's the flat land, and there's no other water nearby that close by. This is going to be the place where it's going to be. And that's what archaeologists use at least as a starting point for identifying sites. It isn't necessarily the only thing, but it is pretty reliable. And when you have an archaeologist that knows an area, they 100% can do that.
And we saw that going back to our first book that we read, The Dig. Basil, he had worked in that area for a long time. He knew the soils and his dad knew the soils. He was a geologist and all that stuff. And so, yeah, once you know an area very well, it's very easy to kind of identify areas that might have archaeological sites.
Mm-hmm. He does talk about we don't just rely on this either. We have sampling strategies. So we've talked about shovel tests before. Those are little 50-centimeter holes that we dig down periodically, like in a set grid to sample and see what's down there. And sometimes we'll hit a site and find a site that way. He actually does a very good description of it. I thought this was good and very appreciated. He clarifies that this is not an easy thing to be doing. You're usually on very tough terrain. Absolutely. You have heavy backpacks and equipment and sometimes pretty long walks to get to the places where you're going to be working. Yep. Insects with diseases, snakes with venom, poison ivy, heat, humidity, cold rain. You're working in almost all that stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I did appreciate his description of survey work just because you and I have both done it, and I feel like people don't understand what that is. And I think he did a really good job of depicting kind of the reality.
Yeah. Like, for example, I used to do a lot of survey in the Rocky Mountain area. And I used to joke, I get paid to go hiking in the mountains. But, when I say that, you picture me on a hiking trail, which, no, I'm walking along a mountain slope, parallel to that mountain slope all day long. And you don't realize how hard that is on your upslope knee when you're doing that, for example, until you're actually doing it for a while. And you, of course, have worked in swamps a lot.
Yeah, it was funny because I was just talking to a friend the other day and she said that I seem more outdoorsy now than when she met me. And I was thinking about that. It's because when she first met me, I was doing survey work. And so in my pastime, I did not want to be outside.
Right.
Now it's like, we work largely indoors. And so I'm like, oh, let's go for a hike. Let's go visit this area, this park, blah, 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 because it's fun for me again. But it actually kind of took a while.
Yeah, same. Absolutely. He talks about different ways we can assemble some evidence. He says archaeologists are like detectives of the human past.
Yes.
Yes. We use that analogy quite a bit to talk about what archaeology is and how it works.
Yep. I used it the other day when I talked to a summer camp group.
But, I like how he ends this section. This is a lot of work. Is there an easier way? And that's when we lead into the psychics.
Yes. Which he's talked a little bit about psychics in previous chapters, but this really does a deep dive.
He starts off with locating sites and how basically some psychics claim they can like point at a map and spot it. It's all very fun reading. I didn't feel like a lot of depth to talk about, but I did kind of chomp at the bit because he wasn't talking about dowsing rods, at least to start with. He eventually gets there.
I found it interesting because I didn't know that people thought that psychic archaeology was a thing. I've never actually heard that term. Like, it's never really come up in my world that there are people out there that feel that they can find sites through psychic methods, really. Like, I've heard of the dowsing rods and stuff.
Which is a psychic method, though, to be clear.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a mysterious power this person says they have.
When he was talking about there was I guess, department at Princeton that studied anomalies. They had like a laboratory that was trying to prove that psychic power could help find historic and prehistoric sites, and how they closed it because it wasn't successful. It's like, people really put that much like thought and energy into thinking this was actually real. And I get the desire to try and prove it either way.
Or to test it.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's been things we thought, no way, until we test it.
Yeah.
And find out,
and actually. I guess I'm going at it from, our current understanding. So I definitely have a lot of bias. But to think that a university like Princeton would put that much...
How Ghostbusters started.
Yeah. I'm just like, wow.
Which is 100% accurate and reliable.
It just blew my mind. I was like, goodness.
Yeah. There are people who apparently do cultural reconstruction using their psychic powers. So you give them an artifact and they can interpret said artifact. But essentially, it's been very well established that either they're using readily available information or they're just making it up in ways that can't be disproved. It's pretty much just comes down to that. It's pretty easy. He actually has a personal anecdote where he does a test of this himself. Does he have this anecdote in yours? This one, he had a student on a field school who had a friend who claimed to be psychic.
Oh, no, this was not in mine.
Yeah, and this student wanted him to utilize this friend's psychic abilities. And so he basically says, okay, we'll do a test. And so he has the person come into the lab and they hand them artifacts to read and reconstruct. And all these artifacts had, various stories behind them. But what Fader didn't tell them was that he had made them all himself.
I was just going to ask if they were actually modern reproductions.
Oh, he acknowledges, I am not a nice person. But he says the psychic was disappointed and apologetic that it hadn't worked, but basically explained it away through some, I don't remember what it was. It was some very weak, like, well, maybe it's something that was interfering, or I don't remember what it was. But I remember it was weak enough that I just wrote explain it away as something. I didn't actually bother to explain what it was. So that was an interesting little anecdote about this.
Yeah, in mine, he talks about how, I guess, when they're trying to recreate stories of these objects, they kind of lean into like popular notions of, like, if you give them an arrowhead, for example, obviously that's Native American. So they're going to lean into kind of these popular beliefs regarding Native Americans that are kind of generalized. They're not specific to a specific time period or a specific tribe. And it's all kind of like open-ended.
I think he establishes that it's not all shysters necessarily. Some of these people definitely are. But he seemed to honestly believe the person he tested believed. So he wanted to kind of establish that. It's not like this person was out to con. I think that's important too.
That's interesting.
Yeah. He
doesn't really talk much about that in my book, if at all, honestly. But it's... Okay. I wonder the psychology behind just that.
Right.
Yeah.
Same. So basically the verdict here is that, psychic archaeology would be fantastic if it worked. Like, if it worked, we would be using it.
Right.
And it comes down to that. It's that simple.
If we didn't have to traipse on a mountainside digging 50-centimeter holes.
Right.
We wouldn't.
Dodging snakes and rain and getting hailed on.
Right.
And then we move into dowsing for a little bit, which, okay, so not everyone necessarily knows what dowsing is.
I was just going to say, yeah.
So dowsing, you usually see it associated with finding water for digging a well, typically.
Yeah.
And there are different forms of it. Sometimes it's a stick with a Y and they hold the Y end until the point supposedly moves. Sometimes I've seen it with coat hangers.
I was going to say coat hangers are popular.
At 90-degree angles for handles, and you hold them apart, and at the point where they supposedly cross themselves is the location you're trying to find. And again, typically this has been associated with finding water. It does not work with finding water. It's been tested, and it definitely doesn't work with artifacts.
Have you ever run into anybody anybody doing this?
We had a site where we had someone out dowsing the site.
Yep, I had someone too, and they were using the coat hangers.
Mhm.
And it was interesting because he was trying to show us how he did it, and we were trying to be nice. But we were like, huh?
In ours, I don't remember quite clearly how this developed, but I remember the crew chief who was in charge was humoring this person. So they were like a local they were trying a good relationship with or something. It didn't affect what we did at all.
Same, yeah, it was
But
very
they were
similar
kind of
situation.
just being polite with the person, not trying to put them down. But I was a little weird that we were even humoring it, frankly.
Yeah, same.
So after that, we go into the real deal archaeology, as he usually does. Like, how do we actually identify stuff without digging? And he talks about various types of remote sensing. I don't remember how much we've talked about that here, but ground penetrating radar is a fantastic tool that we use quite a bit. There's different ways we can look underground with different materials. Magnetometer will detect fluctuations in magnetic waves, for example. LiDAR is a huge one now. We've talked about that, I think. And actually, we'll talk about that even more in
Our next book, yeah.
In The Lost City of the Monkey God, which we're going to read.
Oh, going back to the dowsing, well, just pseudoscience in general, I guess, is I was surprised again at how many organizations have existed to try and prove or disprove various forms of pseudoscientific research. And I guess there was the James Rand Fund, Educational Fund, set up a prize for anyone that could prove that like a pseudoscientific method works, and the prize is still there waiting for someone to claim it, I guess.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is interesting. To me, working in the scientific field, I guess we kind of have a tendency to be like, yeah, that's obviously not going to work and kind of brush it off. But to people who maybe aren't inundated with it every day.
Well, it doesn't mean it shouldn't have testing, but it does maybe limit how many resources we should commit to it.
Yeah, that's my thing. Like, I get wanting to test it because that's science, right? But the amount of resources that have been used to test these things is kind of outlandish to me.
Right. We do finish my chapter with going back to Squire and Davis. If you remember that, we talked about that last chapter. They were one of the first very thorough mapping of mounds in North America.
Their 700-page report.
No, that was the guy after them.
Was it? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
These guys are famous because they made a whole bunch of maps of mounds that no longer exist.
That's right. Okay.
And the maps are reasonably accurate, and we know that. And it's not perfectly, but very close. And actually, in this one case, they went to a site where there's supposed to be some of these mounds that were just gone from farming, and they did a magnetometer survey of it, and boom, there's the mounds. They could see them very clearly, and apparently this land has since been purchased, and they're growing grass on it, and they're leaving the grass grow tall where the mounds were.
Oh, cool.
But I think it's a very cool way of interpreting that. So I like that a lot. So I want to make sure to point that out.
Yeah, in mine, he kind of ends the chapter talking about how non-invasive techniques like magnetometry, LiDAR, all that kind of stuff will possibly never replace digging, but how they're becoming increasingly important and useful, especially in areas like burials where we don't want to necessarily disturb sites. And he talks a little bit about how archaeology is destructive. And so having these non-invasive techniques is revolutionizing archaeology. And remember, this was written in the early 2000s.
I would say it still is, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's just we now have even more capabilities technology-wise.
And it's not entirely unreasonable to think that this technology may replace most of the digging at some point here.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's fine with me.
For scientific reasons, also because I'm tired of digging holes.
Right. Well, and like, I mean, it is a destructive science. So anything we can do to manage that destruction and minimize it is worthwhile.
Right. Exactly. That's kind of what I mean. Ready for the final full chapter?
Yes.
So, last chapter, I've got old-time religion, new age visions, and paranormal prediction.
Oh, so mine's just old time religions, new age vision. That's it.
Okay. He starts off with actually a very nice, because a lot of this book, I think you could say, depending on your point of view, is a little abrasive.
Yeah.
And intentional. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah, and I think he's somewhat, like, he gets snarky in places, but he tends to get most snarky in places that I would argue are
fully justified.
Yes.
Right. He starts off this chapter very nicely with a bit saying he's not here to challenge religious beliefs. But when people try to claim physical archaeological evidence of their beliefs, then those beliefs are open to testing and
Right.
challenge.
Yeah, he talks about like moving from theology to more of a scientific
Right.
conversation about it, which is fair.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of talks about how we got to some of our current situation. Specifically, we're talking about intelligent design in
Mm-hmm.
mind. He starts with the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, where a Georgia teacher,
Tennessee.
Tennessee teacher was trying to teach evolution and got taken to court over it. They lost, never had to pay the fine because of
Clerical errors.
clerical errors,
Yeah.
which is, I guess, okay on their part.
Yeah.
And it's usually treated as a win, but he makes a case here that this is actually not, because what a lot of textbook manufacturers did then is just starting to exclude evolution as a matter of course. So like 30, 40 years of kids basically got zero evolution education.
Right.
So it actually was a pretty big setback in reality. And then he talks about kind of the tactics to shoehorn creationist perspectives into science education.
Yeah, the scientific creationist.
It started off by just trying to suppress evolution.
Yeah, that didn't work.
It didn't work. Ultimately, it started to lose ground. He calls it creationist creep. When finally they started teaching evolution again, they altered their strategy. They tried to force teaching of scientific creationism. And he makes a point that not all ideas are worthy of equal consideration in science.
Yes.
Like it shouldn't be put on equal footing as everything else. And this is one of them. He actually gives a couple very poignant examples, such as slavery was bad versus slavery was good, actually. Spoiler alert, it was bad.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't really go into that kind of detail in mine.
He also references Holocaust denial as like this is an idea that is not worthy of equal time for teaching of the Holocaust, which some people would disagree with, unfortunately. So yes, not all ideas are equal. And he also, and I love this, if we're going to humor one creationist story, then we should have to humor all creationist story. And actually that's been kind of the way some places have undermined this a little bit, I guess, these efforts.
Yeah, that's true.
One of my favorites is one of the satanic churches.
Yes.
Like they're ready to jump on this stuff every chance they get, and I'm always very amused by it.
Yes. I will say in my book, he does make a point to talk about how the Christians, the sect of Christians that are, mostly fundamentalists, but I don't know if that's true for all of them, that try and push this kind of stuff are not actually reflective of most Christians.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of the loud majority or the loud minority,
Right.
The squeaky wheel kind of situation. He does make a point to point that out in my book, which I appreciate.
Oh, he does mention too that we actually have 2 privately owned but publicly funded museums that push some of these ideas as well, creationist ideas. One of them is the Creationist Museum.
Yes.
And I actually know some people that went to that when we were working nearby. And I would have been tempted, but I didn't want to give it money. But they were just flabbergasted by it, very amused. And actually, I love this. This is one of my favorites, is they had a wall that listed the deceivers. And would you believe that archaeologists were amongst the deceivers?
Oh, no.
We were very proud.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well.
There is also Ark Encounter, which is a supposed recreation of the Ark. Has been just a huge money seek, apparently.
I've seen videos of it. Like people that will visit it will go and put their videos on YouTube. And I've seen they had like crates with dinosaurs in them and stuff.
You can actually watch one where Bill Nye actually goes and debates the owner and operator of the museum. It's very uncomfortable because it's just clearly pointless. But if you're really curious about these things, you can see them.
In your book, does it give kind of a ranking? And this is probably out of date now because this is, I think, done in the 90s, but 2005, sorry, kind of a ranking of how states treat evolution in schools.
No.
Oh, mine does.
Kansas is pretty poor, I bet.
So it goes by sound passing, marginal, failed, worse than failed, no data. And Florida is in failed. So is Georgia, Alabama, pretty much a lot. You notice if you're like familiar with the Bible Belt in that area, a lot of the failed and like worse than failed are kind of in the Bible Belt
I bet
area.
Kansas is failed.
Kansas is the one that is worse than failed.
Yeah, okay. So I grew up in Nebraska, for folks that are listening, so I was very aware of Kansas' efforts in like the turn of the century to suppress teaching of evolution still, which always boggled my mind. Then we move into the latest tactic, which is intelligent design. This is basically the same old thing, new look, and it essentially argues that everything is so amazing there had to be a creator's hand, and the author points out that there's no evidence of this creator's hand, or if the creator was, they were incompetent or malicious because of all the like malignant cancer protesters and stuff like, this is bad design.
Oh,
Or
wow.
even like swallowing food through the same tube that we breathe through. That's just a flawed design. Like, yeah. So anyway, he doesn't have much patience for this. I will say that back many, many years ago, this did suck me in because it doesn't come off as immediately what it is. And then finally I realized kind of, no, wait, this is just creationism in a new form. And I'm like, well, I'm done with this. But
Yeah.
it is very easy when it's presented to you to not fully understand all the context.
Did he talk anything about some of the Ark hoaxes?
That's the next bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I will hold off because
Well, we
some
can
of
go
those...
right into that now. Go ahead.
Well, he talks about several different ones, and obviously, they talk about, oh, we found the Ark here, and I guess Mount Ararat in Turkey. Conveniently, all evidence was destroyed by the Soviets at one point. And there's also a guy who claimed to have a piece of the Ark, and it was tested, and it was shown to be California pine soaked in teriyaki sauce to age it.
Awesome.
So that was my personal favorite.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Actually, interestingly, he doesn't talk any about hoaxes in this one. He talks about actual attempts to vindicate, I guess. So he uses a little bit of like logic reasoning to address the idea of the Ark as a literal depiction of things that happened. I don't need to go into all of this, but basically the size that it would have to be didn't remotely exist until the 1800s.
Right. Yeah, he talks about that in mine as well.
And then think about what we understand about the size of the world today, and a handful of people saving 2 of every animal is a little, like, think of all the thousands and thousands of species we know of today. How could they have actually managed that?
Right.
Also, 2 of each animal is unsustainable for a population. Is importantly, we know that now too.
Yeah, he talks about that in mine too, about how even just having 2, so many would have gone extinct.
Right. Well, we have some cases, I think, where some species are down to a few hundred and they're considered extinct.
Yeah.
So anyways, just kind of lays out some of that information. I didn't touch on all of them, just kind of hit some of the highlights.
It was interesting to me too, having to deal with a lot of the biblical archaeology, the creationist archaeology, the stuff, and how there's a lot of quote documentaries on educational channels. He kind of starts, I was surprised because my book was written in 2005, and he starts to talk about how a lot of these educational channels are starting to put these documentaries on TV. And I guess at some point, some people started challenging them, like, hey, this isn't true. And they always claimed then to be in the business of entertainment. I was like, wow, this was happening earlier than I thought.
A lot longer than we thought. Yeah. He talks about evidence of a flood. Did he talk about that in yours?
A little bit,
this was interesting because, like, for one thing, if there was a worldwide flood, we would see geological evidence. There is none. Also, we would see archaeological evidence. This would, like, have a very obvious impact on human cultures and society and technology. No evidence of that. And then he gets into, do remains exist? And he talks about some of the claims of having found remains. One of them is, you might heard of, petrified wood at the top of Mount Suleiman, I think. If I'm saying that right. But just by photographs, geologists can say, well, this is just ordinary sedimentary rock. Talks about possibility of it being inspired by a local event, which I don't think he necessarily disproves here, but there is an interesting hypothesis that the connecting points in the Mediterranean to the oceans are higher than some other places. And so actually during the Ice Age, the Mediterranean was isolated from the ocean.
Yeah, he talks about that in my book, and there's an illustration in there which I was thankful for, because I was having a hard time picturing what he was discussing at that point.
There's actually a cartoon called XKCD online who did a whole like long series about using this idea in an interesting way. And so basically it's kind of cool because it just tells a story and doesn't give us any context. But the creator like understood how like constellations would have changed. Like I think they decided ultimately like almost about 2,000 years from now. And so people looked at the stars he made and were able to date this as like a future event using the same idea. That's where I got introduced to the idea. So it was very cool.
That's kind of cool. Yeah.
So the idea was that they're separated, and then as the ice caps melted, all of a sudden there was a gush of water flooding the area, and it was a catastrophic and dramatic thing for people living within what is now underwater Mediterranean. He does very clearly say that there is no evidence of this archaeologically or geologically, though. So it's an interesting idea, but it just doesn't seem to be held up by actual information right now, at least.
Right. Mine talks a little bit about the Shroud of Turin. And
Right.
I found that interesting just because I've had a lot of people like at festivals and stuff come up and ask me about it. And I've never really had the background to be able to discuss it. So I kind of just say, oh, I'm sorry. I don't really have a lot of information on that. I'm not a biblical
And
archaeologist.
you might still say that.
I probably would because but it was interesting to learn because he talks a little bit about burial practices of the times, what is written in the Gospel of John, and a little bit of the history of the actual object itself. But the way they buried people essentially is not represented in how the Shroud of Turin is represented. It's, one single piece of fabric.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they would have a separate piece of fabric that would cover their face. And so the size, the shape of the shroud and everything just doesn't work with what would have historically been done. And then also in the Gospel of John, the way they talk about how he was buried, the shroud doesn't represent what is written in the Gospel of John. So it was just interesting to me personally, just the history of the Shroud of Turin itself and how it's kind of been used and moved around and traded and, this kind of stuff. So that was kind of fun to read.
Yeah, and we get people coming up to us and trying to talk to us about biblical archaeology on a fairly regular basis. And we're always kind of about it. Because most of the time it seems like that kind of archaeology is associated with trying to prove beliefs rather than actually testing scientific ideas and trying to understand the past. People who are actually doing archaeology of these time periods, I think they're doing fantastic work, and I'm very excited about what they learn because that can give us a lot of insight to the cultures that are represented in that time period.
And I should clarify, biblical archaeology is actual archaeology, but they're actually studying it scientifically. So
right, but that is not necessarily what people always mean when they say it.
Exactly.
People claim to be biblical archaeologists that are not doing archaeology.
Right. Yes, but it is an actual branch of archaeology that does exist and is legitimate if done
when
correctly.
People approach us and ask us about it, we're like, oh boy.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Does your book talk about New Age?
Before we go to that, we talk about Glen Rose, Texas. So this is the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Essentially ignores all evidence except anything that people think maybe supports this idea. So the Glen Rose, Texas thing is they feel like they have found fossilized human and fossilized dinosaur footprints in the same place.
Okay, yes.
It was first found around 1939, and the scientist who first observed them observed that there were giant fake human footprints being sold by locals in the town. And actually, there are genuine dinosaur footprints in this riverbed. There are obviously fraudulent human footprints, sometimes ridiculously large. And then there are a lot of ambiguous, narrow footprints that no one can agree on what they remotely are because they're just not in good enough shape to be able to tell what they actually are. So it's just kind of silly, and it's basically what's been feeding this. A lot of it is the classic hoax stuff we talked about before, right? Where there's money involved, or there's some kind of prestige, or it's supporting someone's idea of how things should work. And so people are buying into it for those reasons themselves.
Yep.
There's even I saw a good, a store apparently has oversized human footprint molds that supposedly came from the area. And it just kind of amazing. Yeah.
That's awesome. I still am. This whole book, one thing that I've really enjoyed is how these hoaxes become part of kind of pop culture and history in and of themselves is kind of funny to me.
Right. I almost like them
because of that. Yeah.
when there's enough time after that. I mean, if they're new, then I don't have much patience for them. But if they're 100 years old, all of a sudden I think they're interesting. So next we move into New Age prehistory. That was what you were talking about, right?
Yes. And this is something that I have personally always kind of tried to grapple with. And so I appreciate having some guidance and reading about, he's looked into this and he has a really good understanding of it. Because I've always been kind of I don't know how I feel about some of this stuff. But essentially New Age religion, beliefs, I don't know what you want to call it. And there's a lot of information about New Age, where it originates from and stuff like that online. But it's like it's Native American sites being attributed kind of spiritual significance by mostly white people. It romanticizes them, and it essentially appropriates indigenous religion and both their like religious beliefs and also their cultural traditions and things like that, and their images for kind of their own spiritual salvation, I guess you would say. And it was interesting because he talks about some of the Native American that he mentions in this book have issue with it because they take it as Indian religion. And I say that in quotes. So it takes from all these different tribes things that aren't necessarily believed by every Native American group and throws them together. And it's kind of cherry picking different spiritual elements to fit white people needs. I don't know. It's
popular religion.
Yeah. And he said, it's this concept that's kind of one of the Native Americans he interviews calls it they're cherry picking items and putting them for sale in a cosmic marketplace. And I was like, ooh,
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
But a lot of Native Americans are like, we're not repositories of indigenous spiritual knowledge. Like they're not these gurus that are just sitting around wanting to share their intellectual information about their religion. Like they're people. They live in today.
It is kind of a form of dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And it's problematic for that reason.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. Mine doesn't go into all that detail. Basically, all it has is kind of a personal anecdote.
Really?
Which kind of shines a light on how ridiculous some of this is. So he talks about the Sedona New Agers, which is out west. And he had a case where he was out at a park, which is mostly very quiet. And he's going to get taken by a park ranger to go see a site, cliff dwelling. And apparently, about as he's doing this, a bunch of people who are very much not in shape for intense hiking out in the wilderness of American Southwest show up and they start going. And the park ranger says, whoa. No one's allowed to hike around out here without a guide. And they get all huffy because, we were told that we could have a personal, private moment with this holy place or whatever, spiritual place. And he's like, well, tough, because I have to be with you and I have already committed to this guy. You have to wait. And so our author said, no, you go ahead. I'll just wait here. And he went out with them, and they came back sometime later, and the park ranger was just, apparently, I got a sense he almost couldn't contain himself, because the holy site they took them to, he was expecting they were going to take them to like a cliff dwelling or something. It was a 20th century homestead site they thought was an ancient Native American site.
Okay, as an archaeologist, I'm very baffled that someone wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Right. I don't know what ruins were, it was probably just some piled stone ruins or something, and maybe they couldn't tell. But I feel like if you use a little critical thinking, you could, but that's not what was going on here. So they went and they had their spiritual encounter with this super ancient site that actually wasn't. And it's just kind of very, this section is very amused by the whole thing. He doesn't treat it as a fundamentally problematic behavior, which I thought was interesting because as your section talked about, it very much is.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I thought was interesting is he refers specifically to Native American beliefs, but my understanding is a lot of New Age religion also comes from like ancient European traditions as well, and it's kind of mixed that together with the Native Americans.
Sometimes Asian.
Yeah.
Like I know Buddhism was so popular in the 90s or something like that, right?
Yeah. So I thought that was kind of interesting that he specifically talks about just the Native American component, whereas, and I did a little Googling. Some of it I was like, oh great, now this is in my search history, but it does kind of pick from all these different religions. And there's nothing wrong with having spiritual belief, but one of the issues I personally have with this is you don't have the context. Like I've known people who have gone to ayahuasca retreats in South America and Central America, and the person that is their shaman is like some white dude, and I'm like, well, that can't be a shaman because traditionally a shaman would have been someone who had generations of knowledge passed down to him and would have been working with the same population, therefore would have had an understanding of how this person's father and grandfather and great-grandfather have reacted to certain, medicines and things like that. And a white dude in the Amazon isn't going to have that. So it's just interesting to me. That's always been one of my issues is just the lack of cultural context.
It's something that's been overused and it's a little difficult to find, but cultural appropriation is an appropriate label here, I feel like.
Yeah,
Right?
I
It is
feel
taking it, trying to make it into something that's not yours
yeah.
when you should be just kind of respecting it from a distance or leaving it alone.
Yeah. And then in mine, he goes into talking about the ghost dance.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, well, I won't go into too much about it because honestly, I don't feel knowledgeable enough to discuss it. But he talks about revitalistic movements and how, and this was a dance that I guess numerous Native Americans did as a response to threat. Like thousands of Indians apparently across the country kind of joined into this dance, and just reading about it was kind of sad. But the author kind of almost made an attempt to show how these New Age beliefs could also be seen as a revitalistic movement because it's people who are feeling threatened, and so they're seeking spiritual kind of guidance or salvation. But I was like, okay, I would disagree with that because what the Native Americans were facing, such as removal and their children being sent to white schools and things like that, is vastly different than like my mom won't buy me a BMW or what, you know what I'm saying? Like the comparison just isn't there. It's like comparing apples and oranges to me.
Well, and I feel like if we were talking about some of these religions, if they were like open to outsiders and wanting outsiders like Christianity, Buddhism, various ones that actually welcome people to become a part of it, this could be a different conversation. But some of these are not meant for us.
Right.
And we should be okay with that.
Right. Yes. So it was that kind of got the hair on the back of my neck kind of standing up. I was like, I don't know if I would agree with that.
Well, that's interesting because he doesn't have that at all in mind.
So
he's apparently maybe had a rethought on that as well.
Maybe, yeah.
Well, the whole conversation around appropriation happened after your book was published, I think. So maybe that's been part of that. Mine instead talked about crystal skulls.
Yes, mine does not, but please go on.
It isn't a huge section, but I enjoyed it. So basically he says, most of you probably know it just because of the Indiana Jones movie. Otherwise, it's almost unheard of. People don't know about them much.
The worst Indiana Jones movie.
Yes. And actually, if you want to hear what we think of the latest Indiana Jones movie, you can check out a special episode we did last year now. That would be, wouldn't it? Where we gush about how much we enjoyed it, even though apparently not as many people enjoyed it as much as we did. But I stand by enjoying it.
That's okay.
Yep. But this one basically says the actual crystal skulls are just as fictional as Indiana Jones.
Yes.
The more reasonable claims are that these skulls are genuine artifacts that represent the talent and sophistication of the people who made them. The problem is not a single one has any archaeological context, and a fair number of them have been very clearly shown to be fake, like evidence of contemporary tools, for example. Apparently, and made me a little sad, Dan Aykroyd apparently really loves them, to the point where he actually has Crystal Head vodka that he sells, and it's filtered through actual diamonds, which are apparently actually quartz crystals and not actually diamonds.
Lovely.
So that doesn't have much of a point to his argument, but I feel like this is just one of those things that he loves so much that he had to include it, kind of like the banjo section of A Small Things Forgotten that we kind of skimmed over because we're like, what does this have to do with the rest of this? But you could clearly just feel the enthusiasm in the story. So I liked it still because it was fun to read. And that's about all I have. There is a couple in the FAQ sections. Interesting points. Start one is, are all scientists atheists? And he says, no, absolutely not. Studies have shown that there is a higher number than the general public, but there's still I think around half to 40% that are religious in some way. The next up was, aren't religion and evolution irreconcilable? And of course, that also is no. And he points out that 2 popes have accepted that evolution was possible, for example.
I actually took a really cool class in undergrad at FSU that was called Religion and Science, and it was in the philosophy department. And it was all about that.
Yeah.
And it was probably one of my favorite classes.
Yeah. Also, 6 major Protestant organizations and the Conference of American Rabbis have also all accepted evolution.
Oh, wow.
So
I did want to just read. I know I said I didn't have anything else. I lied.
Oh.
So I wanted to redeem the author. Because I know I was a little
Well,
harsh
I
about
think he's maybe redeemed him. Go ahead, but I think he's also redeemed himself by excluding that section in my version.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. But the last paragraph of that chapter, he says, and I quote, "It is more difficult by far to empathize with modern, well-off people who seem to be afflicted by little more than existential angst, general depression, or a vague feeling of dissatisfaction with their lives, and who then turn to New Age nonsense."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, all right, we're on the same page here. But I do know that, like, when I first read that and he was talking about revivalist movements and kind of called it that, I was just like, ooh, no, I liked you.
Yeah.
So he did redeem himself. And yes,
Good.
like you said, not including that in future.
The most recent version.
Yeah.
For mine, then there is one last little bit. There's actually an epilogue in mine. Is there one in yours?
So I didn't have an epilogue. I had chapter 12, which I guess it kind of wraps up everything. And it's called Real Mysteries of a Veritable Past. And it kind of acts as an epilogue.
How long was your chapter 12 then?
Not long.
Okay, because the epilogue was very short.
There
wasn't a ton to talk about in my epilogue. I'll go ahead and do that, and then we can, anything in your chapter 12 you want to talk about?
Sure, yeah, talk about yours and then I'll...
So this epilogue, I like the title. It's just titled A Past We Deserve. And that is referencing, of course, we deserve to understand this past. We deserve to appreciate the reality rather than the fiction. And as we talked about, the reality is often far more interesting. He starts with a subline that is already, frankly, a little dated. If cable's part of the problem, can it also be part of the solution? Which, cable? What is that? He talks a little bit about the idea of the Victorian spookiness of the past. And so if you look at a lot of Victorian era books, they're dealing with this. He references specifically Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskerville. There's a lot of dealing with spooky abandoned ancient sites and stuff in that one.
Yeah.
And how this treatment of that past has not gone away with modern stuff. And he has a pretty self-deprecating anecdote of him trying to pitch a show idea he had to a TV producer who called him. He wanted to do a show highlighting the 50 publicly accessible but most underutilized archaeological sites in America. And he wanted to travel around to these sites, do a thing about them and history and show the vistas of them and everything. And he did this whole pitch, and apparently then the TV producer said, that's fine, but we're looking for something that involves treasure or alien or Atlantis or something like that. Or mysteries and treasure, I think is what it was.
Oh, goodness.
And it's could not get him around, and he's like, I should have known. My idea would never have flown. He does talk a little bit about the kind of conflict between popular media and interpretations of the past. And essentially this comes down to the idea that an archaeologist saying, all right, we did this study that showed that some of these other ideas are probably right, but here are some of the flaws with the study, and here's some of the more questions we have. That does not make a good headline compared to new discovery, things have changed, Then that kind of ties us back into how this book started, of course, too. And he points again out that all pasts are constructed, but not all are equally plausible, which is a good way of putting that. In a final quote that I want to read, but I believe that I have tried to show in this book that we deserve better, and we can do better. We deserve a veritable past, a real past constructed from the sturdy fabric of geology, paleontology, archaeology, and history woven on the loom of science. Finally, I hope that I have shown in this book that the veritable past is far more interesting than that constructed by the fantasy weavers of frauds, myths, and mysteries.
That is the exact ending of my chapter 12.
I thought it was a good, well said, good summary of some of his core ideas. Well done.
So in mine, it must be a little bit longer than the epilogue, but I love the way he starts it out because he's like, I admit it, though I am a professional archaeologist with more than 30 years of experience excavating, analyzing, and writing about the human past, I continue to be awestruck when I am in the presence of remnants of antiquity. And I was like, yes, no matter how many years of archaeology you have under your belt, when you visit a cool site, you're going to think it's cool.
Honestly, I feel like with more experience has really brought home even more to me.
Yeah.
How cool some of this is. I remember when I was even in field school, we were looking at some of these mound sites, and they're talking about how many shovelfuls or basketfuls it took to build them. And it was partly beyond my comprehension.
Right.
But as as I've delved into this stuff more, I think I gained a deeper understanding of actually how monumental those constructions are.
He goes on in mine to talk about the cave paintings in Europe, and he talks about how one of the things I found really neat, he talks about various types and the geometric patterns, and he does talk a little bit about how some people think that a lot of them are very obvious. They, it looks like a horse, it looks like this, it looks like that, but he said there's not a ton that are just people. There's animals, there's geometric shapes and kind of maybe mystical looking beings, and we may never really know why they painted these on the walls. Are they their stories? Are they just bored?
Right.
There's so many possibilities. But one thing they have found studying in a lot of European caves, there's handprints where they put their hand out and then they would have probably blown through like a reed or something, pigment that they had in their mouth, and it kind of spread and made like a negative image of this person's hand. They have found that the size of the hand, from what they can tell, it was probably like teenagers. And the size always seems to be that of possibly a younger person. And so he's like, are these teenagers just going around tagging caves? Like, what's going on here?
We have activity we do called ancient graffiti, where kids will draw something using pictograms kind of like this and then put it on our cave wall. I remember very clearly I had a dad talking to me one time, and he's always wondered, like, was this 10,000 years ago? Was there some Neolithic dad saying, "Oh, that's never coming out," and then 10,000 years later, it's still on the wall? That was great.
They say that based on like the size of the hands and everything, that they were probably individuals between 13 and 16 years old-ish. That's fascinating because like, is this an example of like teenage angst? That's like ancient, who knows? But it's really cool
Rites
to kind
of passage. It could be a whole bunch of different things.
And the point he's trying to make is like, these were people, and there are some things we may never know, but there are also some things that quite possibly haven't changed.
Right. Well, like some of like the Viking graffiti.
Right. Yeah.
One of my favorites is way, way up a wall, like way beyond what a human could reach on their own. There is actually some Viking graffiti that says just "Halfdan was here." Which is
that's
fantastic.
So cool.
Like you said, some things just haven't changed.
Right. And he talks about like, is this just people wanting to make their presence known? And I was thinking recently I rebuilt my backyard deck. And one of the things I did is on one of the under joists that you can't see, I wrote my name and my boyfriend who helped me. And then I wrote the year. Nobody's ever going to see that until they redo my deck years down the road. But it's just something I felt would be kind of fun to do. And it reminded me of the handprints. Well, he talks a little bit about the Maya here, and we've kind of really already gone over that a little bit. And he talks about how you can see, talked about with the Egyptians, how you can see that it wasn't just a thing that just happened all of a sudden. Well, you can also see that with the Maya. And he talks a little bit about like the agriculture and how as their population grew, they had need for more land, and that may have led to warfare because they were taking land, and, the evolution of how the Maya expanded, and then possibly we don't really know what caused like the massive downfall. And it reminded me of Lost Cities, where it's like, well, they're still there.
They're still there.
Right. So, and he kind of touches on that a little bit, but he doesn't go into anywhere near the depth of Lost Cities. But I immediately like it clicked. Yeah. This is where also he talks about Stonehenge, which you've pretty much already touched on everything he talks about. Okay. Yeah. And then he kind of ends with the similar kind of thought, like we get what we deserve. I took it as kind of a warning almost. Like,
I got it more. He says we deserve better.
We deserve better, but also in order to get what we deserve, we need to seek it out and not just fall for like the easiest. We need to learn to think for ourselves, essentially, and not just, thinking about like all the documentaries, in quotes again, documentaries that are on TV. Think about them, look at them, and question them. Be a skeptic, as it were.
Well, good. What are your final thoughts on the book as a whole, Barbara?
I really liked it. One thing I noticed is at the beginning, each chapter is about like one hoax. And then at the end, it was like a flurry of just information thrown at us. But also, I feel like what was at the end wasn't necessarily hoaxes.
It was less
So
hoaxes at the end.
yeah, so it worked out, and then it's interesting to see how, because mine doesn't have an epilogue, like it's just chapter 12 done.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see how he pulled from chapter 12 in my book and inserted it into other portions of the book and then created an epilogue, which I think is a great way to do it, because the last chapter in my book was just kind of like, here's a bunch of information,
Right.
and it seemed a little disorganized. So it sounds like he kind of took that and organized it a little better. What did you think?
Very good. I liked his tongue-in-cheek approach to a lot of this. You're right that I was a little concerned at the beginning, but I think he handled it pretty well while being plenty irreverent when it was called for.
Right.
I feel like this is one of the books with our fewest criticisms so far.
I would say so. Yeah. I was a little worried with the new agey stuff, but he
And
redeemed
he fell
himself.
flat a little bit there in your version, I would say.
Yeah.
But still, compared to some other ones, it's very little to criticize, I feel like.
But it's interesting too, because this is the first time we've read different editions. So it's really cool to see how things have changed. And my edition, like, I enjoyed it, but it sounds like it has definitely been improved upon in future editions.
Yeah, and just made more current in some ways too. But not that there's any problem if you don't want to pay for the most current edition.
Right.
Then it's nothing wrong with going with one of the older ones, because as we've established, we more or less cover a lot of the same things.
Honestly, some parts of it were kind of funny because it was like this new internet thing.
Yeah.
You know? So it's kind of fun to read
Kind
that.
of archaeological or historical already, right? Well, cool. So I think that wraps up Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. Let us know what you all thought. We certainly seem to enjoy it. And just a reminder, next time we will be talking about David Drake, the enslaved potter who wrote poetry on a few of his pots. And that's how we know at least a little about him. It's a very fascinating subject, and we're looking forward to getting into it. After that, we will be picking up our usual style of program with The Lost City of the Monkey God by Douglas Preston. And so, like we said, we're very much looking forward to that, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time.
All right. Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.